Welcome all, and thank you for joining TÜVSÜD's complimentary webinar titled Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, What You Need to Know and How to Prepare, presented by Will Orlowitz, Principal at Relic Law, and Nathan Regola, Security Architect, also at Relic Law. Before we begin the presentation today, we have a few housekeeping rules. If you or someone you know is having connection issues, please connect through LAN instead of Wi-Fi, if available, for better connectivity. Also, please view this webinar through the recommended browsers of Chrome, Edge, or Firefox, if available. All participants are muted today to avoid any background noise during the webinar. There may be a time lag between slides. If you are having a problem, please mention it in the chat window, which is the fourth button over from the bottom of your screen. For the questions and answers period of today's session, please submit your questions online via the online Q&A tab, which is the fifth button over at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of today's webinar, we will have a short survey. Please stay on for a few minutes to answer these short survey questions. We truly appreciate your comments and feedback. Now let me introduce TÜVSÜD as well as our session today. TÜVSÜD is world-renowned for providing international testing, assessment, training, and certification services for over 150 years, with offices in over 1,000 locations in 50 countries and represented by over 28,000 employees. As a global leader in management system certification, validation, and verification audits, TÜVSÜD's extensive industry experience and expertise elevate the management systems of our clients through our unique approach towards audits. TÜVSÜD assists companies of all sizes with a tailored audit approach, specific to your company's size and industry. We can support you with various ISO-based management system standards, as well as customized audit solutions, and of course, assisting your company with cybersecurity maturity model certification. If you are looking for a trusted, globally recognized provider that is responsive to assist with your company's transformation and certification needs, TÜVSÜD is your partner. And a little bit more about our session today. The final rule of the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC, program presents contractors with a significant new set of compliance challenges. While the extent of these new requirements may vary by contract, all federal contractors should expect some level of increased requirements after the CMC rollout is complete and should start taking steps now to ensure compliance. During today's session, practical insights and real-world examples will be shared on understanding why a pre-assessment is recommended, benefits of a third-party independent assessor, what the government is expecting and why, what is meant by the specific tier level of cybersecurity requirements, and the goal of the federal government by requiring cybersecurity maturity model certification. Today's session will be recorded, and the on-demand replay will be available soon after the event. And now I'd like to welcome Will and Nathan. Thank you so much for joining us today, and now I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks for the introduction, Susan. So first of all, I just kind of want to introduce Nathan Regola and myself. So Nathan is a principal architect, security architect at Relic Law. He has over 10 years of experience in architecting compliance with various cloud systems. He is a CMMC assessor and has a significant expertise in this space. And myself, I'm principal at Relic Law PLLC. I'm a Cyber AB registered practitioner, and along with Nathan, focus on assisting organizations with complying with federal contracting requirements, specifically those around DFARS 252, 204, 7012, and the forthcoming cybersecurity maturity model certification. And so that's what we're looking to talk about today. So we've come up with some, I think, really interesting topics for this webinar that hopefully will help organizations that are in the preparation phase sort of understand what some of the assessment process looks like, maybe how to think about certain aspects of what the assessment might entail, how it compares to other types of audits, information security audits or assessments that organizations may be more familiar with, and talking about sort of some of the benefits of independent pre-assessment in an area where there's a lot of nuanced knowledge that's necessary in order to navigate some of the CMMC requirements. So we're going to start off by talking about the sort of basic CMMC overview and scoping stuff, and then move on to the next topic. So real briefly, I just kind of wanted to touch on the CMMC final rule. And Nathan, maybe you can walk us through, since you're tracking it so closely, what are some highlights from the new CMMC rule?
Sure. So the final rule made a couple important changes. Obviously, it sort of changed some of the items related to C3POs and the CAICO and the Cyber AB, which is not super relevant to the average DIB company, right? So when we think about DIB companies, the most important changes that they codified, there's a few. So they indicated that properly, scoped VDI endpoints are out of scope for the assessment boundary. So that's great news if you're using a VDI-based architecture. Perhaps your corporate, laptop is going to be the VDI terminal. So as long as that's appropriately set up, right, and that's where pre-assessments, consulting by knowledgeable folks come in, then that's going to not be assessed, the actual endpoint itself. Of course, the VDI infrastructure and is going to be assessed, but the endpoint is out of scope. So that's an important change. They've actually put that in writing. They increased the phase one time period from the proposed rule to 1 year. So the phase-in period of initial, the phase one is now 1 year to kind of permit the ramp up of C3POs and CCAs. That being said, I think it will depend on how the contracting officers adopt, right? If they have guidance that they're not supposed to adopt, but they start putting it in contracts, if the DIB companies don't push back through the bid and proposal phase, then they may actually end up with more people that require CMMC than they forecasted. So I think in the past, people have suggested, right, that once the contracting officers sort of get a hold of a new regulation, right, and they sort of get credit for implementing it, it just kind of remains to be seen how that will roll out across DoD, right? It's a very large department, obviously. So potentially a phased rollout there, but we'll see how that plays out on the contracting officer level. They've made an important change in relation to external service providers and cloud service providers. So it was originally feared by a lot of people that FedRAMP moderate or equivalent was going to be required for security protection assets. So something like a SIM, and we'll get to the scoping in a little bit here. They've indicated in the final rule that FedRAMP is only required if the cloud service provider is storing, processing, or transmitting CUI. So that's a win for DIB companies and the service providers that are supporting them. The FedRAMP only requires for CSPs that are specifically CUI assets. That being said, the external service provider or cloud service provider will have to support the DIB company's assessment. So if that organization does not have a CMMC assessment, then they would be expected to provide evidence or participate in the assessment, depending on the scope of that assessment. So that's a significant burden, right? And it may lead some of those service provider companies to obtain CMMC certificates so that they don't have to participate in every single one of their customers' assessments. But for the small company that's in that service provider business, it does give them the opportunity to participate in their customers' assessments rather than purchasing an assessment upfront. Perhaps they have two customers, right? You'd have to go then. You don't have to go obtain a CMMC certificate. You can participate in assessments and kind of scale as your business scales, and then perhaps someday obtain your own CMMC certificate or FedRAMP if you desired. Those are the
Great,
big
those
ones
are
that I think of.
Yeah, those are great insights. And so for folks that have been tracking things, that'll help them sort of understand where the CMMC final rule landed. And then, of course, the DFARS contracting rule is currently in progress, right? It was proposed back in August of this year. Public comments closed in October, and we're expecting the final rule to likely come sometime probably in mid 2025. And then there's obviously a 3-year phased rollout. So that's where things are in the CMMC ecosystem, and in basic with respect to the regulatory side of things. And those are really the two big pieces that are necessary for the CMMC program to take flight. So hopefully that helps illuminate where things are. Let's go to the next slide. So very briefly here, right, we just want to, for folks that may be a little bit newer to CMMC, right, there are essentially 3 levels, right? Level 1 concerns a basic safeguarding requiring FCI or federal contract information. Level 2, which is, I'm assuming, what most organizations are most concerned with, which is, protecting CUI consistent with essentially the NIST 800-171 standard. And then there's level 3, which may affect certain contractors based on the contracts that they're participating in. And one thing just to note here, I think in general, to kind of color the background, right, CMMC level 2 is, really considerably more rigorous than many expect. And I think some organizations don't realize that until they're, at least some way into preparing. And then there's, differences between self-assessment and assessment by a certified third-party assessor. And I think organizations should be thinking about sort of the detail that's going to be and the level of scrutiny that's going to be applied to their policies and implementations. Nate, really quickly, can you just maybe describe the difference between self-assessment and independent C3PAO assessment?
Of course. So in DoD's mind, right, they're the same, right? So essentially a DIB company is supposed to apply the 32 CFR and the DoD methodology and assess themselves according to, right, the existing requirements to follow NIST 800-171 and self-assess, and then the 32 CFR, which will be in effect in a few days. In reality, I think most C3PO assessments are going to be more rigorous, right, because few DIB companies are going to have the experience and the, for example, certified assessors to be able to conduct the assessment to the rigor that DoD is going to expect under a self-assessment. They're putting, False Claims Act risk on the DIB companies with these self-assessments. And, I think savvy companies will probably end up hiring C3POs, at least their first time around, right, to sort of learn how to self-assess themselves so that they don't have that risk.
Great. All right, so before we really get into the heart of the presentation, it helps, I think, if we talk about some scoping assumptions. And so, Nate, can you, just a short amount of time, walk us through some of these basic assumptions to sort of set the stage for the rest of the material?
Sure. So scoping is one of those, I think, often overlooked things, and it's something we always focus on the consulting side, right? Is you really need to understand the scope. If you think about purchasing a piece of property and you have a survey of the property, you understand the boundaries, right? And you understand what is within those boundaries. So, for example, a house and a shed, right? A house is going to have different building construction standards than a shed, right? People generally don't live in a shed, right? But they live in a house. So there's different standards. And a very similar concept applies within CMMC asset types. So you need to define the boundary of that's going to be assessed. And then within that boundary, you have to label the components as to the rigor of assessment, essentially. And the highest rigor is applied to CUI assets and what are called security protection assets, so things like firewalls, SIMs. Then you have specialized assets, which is a great category because it gives you a lot of flexibility. If you have, for example, manufacturing equipment that you may not be able to secure, this applies in level 2. So level 3, things are a little bit different, but we're mostly focused on level 2. So this is things like government-owned equipment, manufacturing equipment, test equipment, and so forth. You can obviously read the slide here. So that's not going to be assessed to any great depth by a C3PO. Out of scope is, of course, not going to be assessed, but you have to logically or physically separate it using some of the example techniques on the slide. And then customer risk managed asset in the sort of previous versions of this draft rule, there was this idea that companies could define their own risk management process for these types of assets that could essentially process CUI, but we're not supposed to. And they've essentially removed that in the final rule, basically saying they need to have all the requirements applied, so all 110 controls. They just may not be assessed against all of them. So for most companies, they're probably going to look at that and say, really, these are just CUI assets. We ought to treat them as such or make them out of scope, right? And then they don't have any risk. So that was a sort of potential gift from DoD in the draft rule, but it is no longer really a gift. So companies should proceed cautiously with the CRMAs.
Thanks, Nate. So I think, just to kind of highlight some of these issues around scoping, specifically in relation to how an organization should be thinking in terms of CMMC, let's just walk through these questions and kind of answer them, as quickly as is reasonable. But what does a defensible scope look like to an assessor when you're approaching them?
That's an interesting question. So, I think it's the assessor should be drawing on a great deal of their own experience, and it should sort of pass the smell test, right? So if a company proposes that, hey, I have I'll just say a CCTV system that's providing support for physical security and it's out of scope, right? That's probably not going to be defensible, right? Unless you don't need it to satisfy your controls, right? How can you argue? Yes, we kind of review it when we have an incident, but it's not supporting physical security, right? It's a very strange position to take. So that system is probably an SPA or maybe a specialized asset. So, I think it's going to come down to sort of generally accepted principles within the C3PO community. Obviously the assessor's experience, and then what the company is able to articulate and explain throughout that, the early phases of the assessment.
Great.
That may change.
And so okay. And so, right now, who principally must agree on the scope of the assessment? Just, the parties.
Sure. So the DIB company, their representative, and the lead assessor, right, have to agree on scoping. And I said it may change, right? So if the company's just sort of intentionally misleading the C3PO and they agree on it initially, but then during the assessment, it's determined that, this asset is actually another category, then, presumably the lead assessor is going to stop and raise their hand to the C3PO and say, look, this came out during the assessment that, DIB company has said this thing is out of scope, but it's actually in scope. It's an SPA. We've got to pause the assessment, or we're going to fail this control, et cetera, whatever the case may be. Can they reach an agreement? Or do they, abort the assessment under the procedures in place? So, it's important that I think that they have a good working relationship, right? Truthfulness is certainly part of that, and that they can agree on that in the early stages of the assessment, which is where that agreement is supposed to happen.
Great. Now, I think you touched on this a bit earlier in talking about the final rule, but a lot of companies are leveraging MSPs to support, right, their efforts. Can you maybe just describe generally what the requirements for MSPs are going to look like?
Sure. So, essentially they need to have a shared responsibility matrix if they don't have their own CMMC certificate. And if they do, if they have their own CMMC certificate, then they're going to have a system security plan, right? But if they don't have their own CMMC certificate, they at least need a shared responsibility matrix, which in an ideal world, right, is going to say for this assessment objective, MSP is doing X, customer Y is responsible for doing Y, right? And so if you think about that in terms of, let's say take background checks is an easy one, right? So MSP, is going to background check their people by using, XYZ Background Checks Inc. Customer is responsible for background checking their people, right? That makes sense, right? Because generally speaking, a DIB company is not going to outsource their, employee hiring process, right, to the MSP. So the MSP is going to background check their people that support the systems, and the DIB company is going to background check their people. And that would be an example of a shared responsibility control where they each have responsibility. And that's really critical so that the assessor understands what the MSP is doing, what the customer is doing, and that together they're meeting the CMMC requirement, right? So you just can't outsource to an MSP and say, well, I don't know if the MSP is background checking their people. I'm background checking mine. Yeah, the MSP has access to my CUI devices, but maybe they're not background checking the people, right? Then you're not meeting the CMMC controls, right? So just because you outsource something, you have to validate that they're upholding their side of the contract, right? And a shared responsibility matrix is the way that you do that. And presumably you have a contract that requires the MSP to abide by the shared responsibility matrix. And that's your proof that obviously they're going to have to demonstrate that, but if they don't have a certificate, but that you're actually holding them to the shared responsibility matrix.
Great explanation. Thanks, Nate. So I think we can move on and start to talk about some assessment planning topics. So let's jump into that portion of the deck. So the first question here, and I think this might be relevant to some of the audience that's on today, is perhaps, and we can describe it in general terms, but how does a CMMC assessment generally compare to other types of information security system audits, like let's say an ISO 27001 audit?
Sure. So I've helped customers on the consulting side go through ISO 27001, and I would say the biggest change that I see is ISO 27001, depending on who the assessors are, right, that they tend to sort of accept sampling evidence, right, and kind of check that off, where CMMC is much more focused on showing that you have that practice in place across the scope of your information system. So, in ISO 27001, the auditor might ask, hey, do you have virus scanning? And they say, sure, we use this tool, and they see the tool and they go, okay, great. In CMMC, they're going to ask a question like, okay, you say that you have, virus scanning on all of your CUI and SPA endpoints. Show me evidence that you have that virus scanner installed on all of your in-scope assets. And I know you say that you're scanning every week. Show me that you've conducted a scan every week on all of your assets. So it's a much higher bar. You may be doing all those things under ISO 27001, but you may not actually have to show evidence of that. And so CMMC, they're going to be a lot more focused on not passing you until they are convinced that you're doing those practices to the extent that you're supposed to, and then according to your SSP. So, not only are you getting judged against CMMC, you're getting judged with how you wrote things, right? So if you write a really complex process in your SSP, then you're going to be tested against that. So essentially, do what you say and say what you do, right? And that's really the heart of CMMC, and it tends to translate to higher number of resources, right? So I think in most situations that the shortest CMMC assessment at level 2 is probably going to be a week. The only exceptions that I think I see to that are if a company is using an MSP for a majority of their controls, and that MSP has a CMMC certificate, right? That's probably the way you can get, a 1 or 2 day CMMC assessment, just because the div company would be responsible for so little. But if an organization is responsible for 110 controls, I think most companies are projecting a sort of 1 week minimum assessment, and that's 8+ hours a day, right? The div company is probably going to be preparing evidence in the evening so that they have the questions that came up that day, that they have that evidence ready for the assessment team to review that evening or the next day.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. And I think, I'll throw this out there and you can maybe opine on it, but there's other things too that I think we've seen organizations not necessarily consider. When they're preparing for these federal requirements, they haven't really thought through things like, FIPS validated encryption modules across their technology stack, for example, which, may not be all that relevant to an ISO audit, but will be with respect to, their federal requirements. Can you maybe just touch on that briefly and other things that might be, similar?
Sure. So, and I think the FIPS one is a good example. When I think about CMMC, I think about the interrelatedness of the controls, and there's a lot of interrelated controls in CMMC. And I think that, it was obviously built from a NIST, 853, RMF background, and they cherry picked assessment objectives from 853 and made this standard 171, which is essentially what CMMC is assessing. The scoping, right, is arguably a hair different under CMMC, but controls are from 853. And it's really that federal lens that the government thinks about the implementation. And so I think that's a challenge for a lot of organizations that have been supporting the federal government, but don't necessarily come from a federal cyber or architecture background. And that can really, hurt companies. And I think if you also toss in the sort of legal aspect of it, right, when you read the CMMC controls, right, if you understand the exact meaning of the words, that can help you, right? So an example of, transmission, right, of CUI. So, if you don't transmit, paper CUI, arguably, right, from location to location, that might inform how you write your SSP, right? So if you don't transmit paper CUI, then that may essentially relieve you from doing certain things. So you want to be very, the more you understand the requirements, the more you can tailor your implementation so that you don't overbuild, right, and overwrite your SSP, because you're just going to make a higher bar for yourself.
Nate, you mentioned this in passing. Basically, many organizations lack sort of federal security architecture experience. And, as we've consulted with a variety of organizations, one of the, observations I know that you and I have had is that they don't necessarily have the types of resources on hand that are, really geared towards, getting the organization ready in a way that needs to be done. Are there certain key resources that you think an organization should have, or it should at least seek to acquire in preparing?
Yes, and I think a lot of organizations are ultimately going to default to, to consultants, right? Probably those that have demonstrated experience with CMMC. If they're building in-house, obviously federal, RMF background, right? If folks that have taken federal systems through ATO will be helpful on the SSP and documentation side and policy side. And then, that sort of security architecture side where they've come from federal environments or highly regulated environments, right? So if you think about, configuration management baselines and hardening, right? So all the, CIS benchmark STIGs, right? That's all important. That all plays into this with CMMC. And so if you have people with those backgrounds, that's just going to enable you to move faster, because I think that's the other piece of this, right? Is organizations think they can get CMMC ready really quickly. They theoretically can, but they need to have a huge commitment of resources to do that. And more realistic timelines are months and months, or a year or more, depending on the size and complexity of the organization, to be truly assessment ready.
Yeah, and I think that ties into how polished they're going to be expected to be, and we're going to touch on some of those things in the next slide. So why don't we jump to the next one, and then we can start to maybe talk about what the contours of that look like. So thinking about an assessment, and this is a new concept to most organizations, what will comprise a typical C3PAO assessment team?
Sure. So the final role requires a lead assessor and an additional assessor, so a sort of a standard CCA, to be participating in the assessment. The understanding is they don't have to be present 100% of the time, right? So you might have the lead assessor there 100% of the time, and the standard CCA, perhaps there a quarter of the time. So that's sort of up to the C3PO to the extent that they have to fulfill 32 CFR rule and any requirements put out by the Cyber AB. Those are not public yet, but the final rule does not seem to require both of those people to be present 100% of the time. There's also a quality control individual that's responsible for sort of overseeing the quality of the assessment process. I hinted at, it's generally expected assessments will take about a week, unless you're sort of in that special situation where you're inheriting most of your controls from the organization that's already CMMC certified, and there's highly likely to be a path to less than a week. I'll say a day or two in the best case. Assessors. Good.
No, I was just going to ask, Nate, in thinking about how they're going to perform the assessment, maybe you can tie these two things together. maybe just cite some examples of evidence that they may ask for, as they go through the process.
Sure. So, I think the preference for performing the assessments is generally going to be virtual, except for the requirements that have to be performed physically when the organization has, physical assets in scope, such as a facility, with, a badging system, cameras, and so forth. They're likely to be an option for, sort of cloud-only companies with only telework devices to be fully virtual. But, the moment the organization has, a physical facility that's in scope and, cameras, visitor logs, and so forth, then some of those controls are required to be assessed in person. The assessor is going to have an assessment plan, if you will, on the sequencing of controls and evidence, and that will enable the DIB company to prepare, for example, when does the network engineer need to be, present? But ultimately, that will be sort of a back and forth between the assessment team and the DIB company, right? If the network engineer is on vacation, right, then they're going to have to slot the controls that the network engineer can provide evidence for example, live to when they're available. So they have the three options for evidence. You're probably going to see a lot of assessors using two of those methods for each control, especially in the early days, right? Just to cover themselves.
Great. Let's jump to the next slide. So people are, interested, I think, in what types of inquiries and challenges assessors are going to make. Can you maybe give us some examples and, how OSCs can, effectively respond to inquiries and challenges from assessors?
Sure. So it goes back to the scoping question and the polish. And so, I like the personnel security example because I think it's pretty easy to understand, right? So, let's say the company put in place a background check policy in 2023, right? So everybody hired after January 1st of 2023 has been background checked, but they have, 50 people that have never been background checked, right? So you might expect an assessor to say, okay, so you say that you require background checks at hire, that's great. Or how about folks that have been here for 20 years? And, oh, well, we haven't background checked those people. We haven't got around to it. Well, are they in scope? Yeah. They're, accessing CUI and our network engineer. So, that's a situation where you expect the assessment team to really dive in and say, okay, do you have a plan to assess these, to assess their background? Why don't you have their background investigation complete, right? So that's a thing where, you kind of see the breadth of CMMC, right? It's going to be full scope, and the assessment team is going to be highly skeptical, right, of situations like that. And that ideally would come out in a pre-assessment or high quality consulting engagement where they would say, look, you're probably not ready for assessment, right? If you haven't background checked all of your people that are in scope, you probably don't want to present evidence on that, right? Because you're not going to have complete evidence.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. And I think this would be the topic of another presentation, but, OSCs need to understand that, the assessor is looking at each assessment objective and they're looking for, the quote unquote adequacy and quote unquote sufficiency in relation to that assessment objective. So, they will, I think, press on certain issues where they see something that doesn't look quite right. Let's jump to the next slide. So this is just sort of a pretty high level, explanation of the assessment phases, but Nate, maybe you can just kind of talk through each of these pretty quickly and give people a sense of what they are.
Sure. So these come from the CAP that's publicly available on the CyberAB's website. They may update this, right, from time to time. So essentially phase one is planning and preparation, right? So you can think about that as getting a quote, signing a contract with the C3PO, right? Figuring out the dates, right? The locations of on-site visits. That's obviously going to be between the OSC and the C3PO. They're going to work out those details, right? The scheduling, who's responsible on the OSC side, for example, to sign agreements and speak on behalf of the OSC or the DIB company. Phase two is going to be the assessment, right? So obviously the OSC is going to be supporting that evidence collection. They're going to be gathering evidence and participating in interviews. And the CCA, right, may review some evidence remotely or even before the assessment. It can speed up things, right? If the CCA has an initial batch of evidence, is reviewing that asynchronously, and then when they start the sort of actual assessment meetings, they've already reviewed some of the evidence and they have a starting point. There are prescribed meetings and status updates in the CAP that the C3PO is going to be required to conduct. It's a reporting phase, right, where the final recommendations are delivered. Limited practice deficiency is an existing CAP. Obviously, any CAP that is used for formal assessments will be in compliance with the final role. There's a POAM review, if applicable. So this is essentially from the initial draft. There's also going to be the final role permits sort of limited deficiencies and temporary deficiencies to exist. So you can read the exact language and details in the final role, but certainly the C3PO is going to be reviewing those. So for example, you might have had one person that had a background investigation that wasn't the same as your current background investigation, but it's almost equivalent, and the company wrote that up as well. This person's been on medical leave for 6 months, and we weren't able to get them to sign for the new background check, but hey, we background checked 99.9% of the people, and we have this exception for this one person, and when they return from the medical leave, we're going to run the new background check on them. That might be an example of a temporary deficiency. And there's the uploading results to CMMC EMAS at DoD. If the organization qualifies for a sort of conditional CMMC certification, then it's going to have 180 days to remediate those items. And then if they didn't remediate, then their CMMC certification that was conditional would essentially disappear. At the end of that time, if they were able to satisfy all the requirements, then they would receive a final CMMC certification. So phase 4 is optional, right? If the company obtains 110 out of 110 controls met, then they're only going to have, it's going to end with phase 3.
Outstanding. All right. So in the next portion of the presentation, we're going to talk about, let's jump to the first substantive slide of this section. All right. So organizations that are preparing, I think, as you've alluded to, Nate, most of them are going to seek an independent pre-assessment from an external party. And they really, I think, would benefit from understanding what, those pre-assessment teams should look like in terms of qualifications. So, can you maybe talk through, I know we have some bullets here, but can you maybe talk through what you would want to see on a pre-assessment team as an assessor?
Sure. So I would look for, if I personally was looking at it, I would look for an assessment team, a pre-assessment team, right, of at least one CCA, right, or lead CCA that's intimately familiar with the assessment process, right? If they want a real CMMC assessment process, kind of following the rules, obviously, but it not leading to a certification. I think it's critical that at least one person has the prescribed cyber AB training, although that's certainly not required on the pre-assessment side.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think that, points to those first two bullets, which are, they're basically, do they have some proficiency in CMMC? Because you see in the market, right, there's obviously a lot of folks that are, offering services around CMMC, some of whom may have sort of the requisite background and understanding, may not. And so, you really want to look for that, or do your due diligence on the pre-assessment team. I think for objectivity, we point this out, right? They should be conflicts of interest in assessing their own work. So let's say that, and I'm not suggesting, that there's never a case where this wouldn't be acceptable, but, if you have an MSP who's assisting you substantially in, defining your boundaries and other aspects of, managing your environment, and they are also going to perform your pre-assessment, they're going to be assessing a lot of their own work in that sense. And so that's something that you may want to consider and weigh. And they're, deliverables that are useful for the purposes of, correcting areas that need correction. So, they should be able to provide you findings that are consistent with the CMMC assessment itself.
And certainly familiarity with that business, whether it's manufacturing business or it's a consulting business, right? And the technology that's in use will certainly, I think, lend itself to higher fidelity pre-assessment.
Absolutely. So, this presentation, we are emphasizing the value of pre-assessments and why, for many organizations, I think they're going to be critical to their success. So I'll just kind of, walk through these bullet points, but Nate, feel free to comment as well. But I think, these are the overarching benefits. One is they will help ensure, readiness for formal CMMC assessment. They're going to fix, hopefully, critical, categorization and boundary issues before they become a costly setback, meaning before, you're having those conversations with the assessor, and in the early stages of those conversations, you discover that there's assets that you're relying on, for your compute needs or workloads that really should not be included in your boundary for a variety of reasons. For identifying and addressing gaps in CMMC assessment objectives, right? So again, the pre-assessment should really look through the lens of an assessor against the standard by which they're required to grade you. I think obviously you can avoid delays in contract eligibility if you get your pre-assessment done and you're ready to assessed in the timeliness that you need for your commercial purposes. And I think this is just one thing that we've noticed in the variety of interactions we've had with OSCs is that they often do overestimate their actual level of readiness. And I think part of that is misalignment or misunderstanding of expectations. I think part of it is perhaps experience with other information security requirements versus CMMC. And I think part of it is that there's been a lot of self assessment and scoring for SPURS and other reasons. And so I think that those have all contributed to that sort of gap. But Nate, I don't know if you have thoughts on any of those in particular.
I think they're all good points. And, if an organization can sort of do a pre-assessment at, it's certainly going to likely to be less costly than multiple CMMC certification assessments, right? A failure and then obtaining other assessments, that C3PO can't provide consulting under a formal certification assessment. So, that the pre-assessment to me is generally going to be cost effective. It's essentially sort of training for the organization, and likely if they are almost ready, it's helping them gather the evidence and prepare so that when they have that first meeting with the C3PO, they look really polished, and the C3PO is probably going to give them a good price, right? Because I'm dealing with a polished organization. Right? If they see a DIB company that's not polished, I assume most C3POs are going to assume that the organization's, it's going to be a slog, right? It's going to take longer than predicted because the company is going to struggle to, show the evidence and gather the evidence. It's going to be a very drawn out process. It's going to bust the schedule, and it's ultimately going to cost more, right? So they're going to quote it as such. If they see polish up front, they're going to get the best price, right? And have the smoothest assessment.
Absolutely. So we've highlighted here some key pre-assessment activities. So I'll just quickly walk through these. And then again, Nate, if you want to comment briefly on any of them. But really, I think the pre-assessment team is going to focus on reviewing substantive details of the system security plan and the policy documentation. Again, looking at the assessment objectives and the OSC's explanations of control implementations and review periods. Again, they're gonna use the sufficiency and adequacy sort of lenses to look at each assessment objective. They're going to evaluate the scoping, and I think a lot of time up front is spent on scoping. In fact, I think you can say that many of the consulting engagements around CMMC are front loaded in terms of there's a lot of emphasis on scoping, the organization mapping its own data flows, producing architecture with defined and defensible boundaries. And then lastly, sort of, the pre-assessment should involve reviewing the suitability of the underlying architecture for things like FIPS and other things that would probably be relevant, like export restrictions, instant response and evidence preservation, contract flow downs, and audit rights. So the pre-assessment team, for the purposes of CMMC, they may not be grading you on each of those, but those are relevant considerations, at least in the consultative portion of a pre-assessment. So we want to talk quickly about, addressing pre-assessment gaps. So I think, the pre-assessment team should be able to fully explain its reasons where the gaps do exist. And I think that's important because the organization needs to understand how to close those gaps, right? I mean, the pre-assessment is different from the actual assessment in the sense that the consultant that's performing the pre-assessment, and depending on how that relationship is arranged, is there to help support and close gaps, right? Where it's obviously to provide useful findings, but it's also to help close gaps. So I think that's important. The pre-assessment team, should probably make recommendations on how to address the needs of the OSC relative to their system architecture. So every organization has its compute needs. It has its own sort of geographical requirements, and it will have unique architecture challenges. And so, we run into that frequently. And so the pre-assessment team can help with that at some level. And then lastly, we recommend that the pre-assessment be conducted well in advance of the time for the actual CMMC assessment. And as Nathan has alluded to, they can take significant times to close, especially if they involve, changing out important vendors or external service providers, onboarding, new products or services that are going to be able to meet CMMC requirements. Those working their way through procurement and implementation can take a considerable amount of time. Nate, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that. Okay. Next slide. So lastly, we just kind of want to talk about some of the benefits of a third-party, independent assessment. And so this is more or less a checklist. So basically, they're going to hopefully bring CMMC insight and expertise. They should be hopefully independent and unbiased. They're going to perform the trial run, right? So this is it's sort of a mock experience. Hopefully that the process that they undertake the assessment rigor. I think that the pre-assessment, if it's conducted well, is going to be a great issue spotting exercise. I think that those issues are usually spotted very, very early on with scoping, asset categorization, and the like. I think honest critiques are helpful, and some organizations, depending on who is running the process internally, can be, afraid to necessarily be harsh about maybe work that a colleague has done or that the organization has done historically. Maybe past practices are not the best, but hopefully an independent pre-assessment team is going to be able to be honest and kind of cut through that to really reveal areas that require improvement. Actionable recommendations, right? So, hopefully the pre-assessment will be able to call attention to things that need done and then provide sort of some guidance on how to do them and do them efficiently. As Nathan mentioned earlier, having a well-performed pre-assessment can signal to a C3PO that it's going to be a more orderly and smooth assessment process, which may favorably impact cost. And then, depending on the pre-assessment team you work with, right, they may even be of value during the assessment itself to help explain certain decisions that were made, how implementations were performed, et cetera. So those were the key benefits that we identified. And Nathan, again, if you have any additional ones that you think I missed, feel free to add.
Well, I do think supporting a DIB company during assessment is a really critical one, right? So if you think about the sort of relationship between the DIB and the C3PO, it can be really helpful if the DIB company doesn't have a lot of, federal audit experience to have that, well-versed consultant there in the room with them to help explain the evidence and argue for certain positions and ultimately, ideally save some controls, right? Turn not Mets into Mets, right? Because that has huge value.
Great. So Susan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Will. Nathan, great job today. And thanks so much for sharing your expertise on cybersecurity maturity model certification. Just to mention the slide that's shown on the screen right now are the TÜVSÜD training offerings in the cybersecurity space. So take a look at those classes and sign up. Okay, let's get into the Q&A portion of today's session. And the fifth button over from the left, you can submit your questions online. And we have had a few questions that have come in, and we have a few minutes left. So, Will, Nathan, first question, are there exceptions to CMMC certification for small businesses?
Yeah, Nate, I mean, maybe you want to tackle that one.
So ultimately, the requirement to be CMMC certified will come from the contracts that the organization is bidding on or already has, and it's up for renewal. So not every contract is going to require CMMC, the day that DoD may place them into contractual requirements. But if the organization is handling CUI and there is a CMMC requirement, the idea that they're a small business is not going to be adequate justification to not protect the CUI.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. So we have another question. Just a reminder again, the fifth button from the left is the Q&A tab. So if you have a question, please submit it online and we'll get to that. We have another question that has come in. What happens if a contractor fails to comply?
Nate, I think you probably best to answer that too.
So a number of things can happen. So certainly DoD always has the False Claims Act in their back pocket, so to speak, right? So if the company has filed a false certification, for example, attesting that they have 110 out of 110, and they have a certification assessment and they receive a 0, right? So very clearly there's a big discrepancy between the score that they said they had in their own self-assessment and what they were assessed at. That will get that's score from the third-party assessment will get reported into SPURS ultimately through CMMC EMAS, and then the contracting officer would have access to that and then be able to take any remedy from the DoD suite of remedies, such as potentially clawing back money that was paid to the contractor, in the worst case, right, filing a False Claims Act against the contractor. So pretty significant options that DoD has. So I think the key thing is truthfulness, right? So generally, DIBs that are telling the truth, right, are if the DIB assess themselves as 108, right, and the third party assessor assessed them, at 105, right, it doesn't, to me, it's obviously not legal advice, right? It does not seem like a huge discrepancy, right? But if the company assesses themselves at 110 and the third party assessor assesses them at a 0 or minus 110, right, that's a huge discrepancy. So that's I think generally on the consulting side, what companies want to be careful of is just truthfulness. With DoD, it's the untruthfulness that can get companies into trouble. Also, obviously, if you're not, if you're not CMC certified and you're required to be CMC certified to bid on a specific contract or at time of award, then you wouldn't be able to receive the award because you wouldn't be CMC certified. And it goes back to that timeline. In most companies, it's probably going to take them a lot longer to get CMMC certified than they think. So, if a company bids on a contract and has the idea that they're going to get CMMC certified by the time of the award, if the time of award is in a month, right, it's going to be very difficult for them to get CMMC certified, in a month, so that they're eligible for that award. So they may not be able to receive contract awards that they were successful at bidding on.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Another question that has come in, and again, don't forget, fifth button from the left is the Q&A tab. How often do federal contractors need to get recertified?
Nathan, correct me if I'm wrong, but with respect to level 2, right, self-certification is an annual process, whereas third-party certification would be every 3 years. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And there's a few exceptions. So obviously mergers and acquisitions, significant changes in architecture, right? So if you swap out your cloud provider that's storing your CUI, right, that's highly likely to require you to get a new assessment.
Okay. All right. Another question. We have 5 minutes left, so we have 2 more questions. What are some common challenges with respect to achieving cybersecurity maturity model certification?
Is a very high bar in terms of I would say the organizational, maturity. So even though maturity is not officially a part of CMMC, right, in the sense that a DIB company is not going to be assessed for, have you been doing this well for the past 6 months, like in CMMC version 1.0. Writing exactly what's happening and then being able to speak to that during evidence presentation and being, perfect on that at 110 controls across, the 300 plus assessment objectives is very challenging. Most organizations are not accustomed to operating that way. And I think that's the biggest challenge, right? Is ultimately, essentially being perfect and being able to demonstrate that during the assessment, right? Because if somebody can't clearly articulate that, they might get a not met even though they're doing it because they can't explain to the assessor how they are meeting their SSP.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Again, 5th button over is Q&A. One final question here. What is the best way for my organization to prepare for CMMC?
I'll try to field that, and then if Nathan has some additional comments. But obviously, we organized this presentation to help OSCs better conceptualize the effort and resources needed, the expectations that will be upon them, and to think about, how to muster the right team and the right external resources to help them prepare adequately and succeed at this, because I think no organization wants to expend a great degree of effort, time, and resources only to discover that they either aren't ready or that they failed for reasons that could have been, easily addressed if they had just spotted them earlier on. And so that's why we've really focused on the value of an independent pre-assessment by a team that is, that has the requisite expertise and qualifications to do the pre-assessment, and to do it with the degree of rigor and the style and format that would be comparable to their actual assessment, but to be able to also add in useful and actionable feedback, and create those sort of plans to close gaps where they may exist, whether in the scope, the architecture, whether it's in the capabilities of the organization regarding their security practices, whether those are administrative or technical. That's really what we would recommend. But Nathan, if there's anything else that you can think of.
I think if I think about it at a high level, it's just thinking about what resources you have. Sure, it's thinking about what resources you have, whether you have the ability to do it yourself or whether you need to work with, MSPs and so forth to be able to build your CMMC, environment and documentation. And ultimately, I think a lot of organizations are going to choose, external consultants and managed service providers if they can't build those capabilities in-house, because it's also the sustainment aspect of it too.
Okay, Will and Nathan, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you to all of our participants for joining today and learning more about cybersecurity maturity model certification. As a reminder, the recording will be available soon after the event if you or your colleagues have missed any portion of today's session. And don't forget to stay on just a few minutes for a few polling questions. We really look forward to your feedback and appreciate your feedback. And please visit our website, tufsud.com, www.tufsud.com, to learn more about cybersecurity maturity model certification. Okay, so if we can get into the polling real quick. Thanks again for staying on for a few minutes. I'll jump into Okay, was today's webinar content on cybersecurity maturity model certification what you need to know and how to prepare, relevant and helpful to your job? Let's take a minute there to respond. Next question, overall, how would you rate today's webinar? Very dissatisfied, satisfied, or very satisfied? Take a minute to respond. Would you like to have a meeting? Whoop, back. Would you like to have a meeting with TÜV to discuss cybersecurity maturity model certification? Yes or no? And let's see if we can to the next one. Are you interested in receiving a quote for cybersecurity maturity model certification? Yes or no? And are you interested in attending Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Academy training? Yes or no? And thanks again for joining, and we'll share the replay soon after the event if you missed any portion of today's session. Thanks everyone. Thanks, Will, Nathan.